Welcome to welcome to Be More News USA. We are very excited to be here today, and we have a very informative show for you. Unfortunately, Donnie Glover is not here with you today, and he's asked me to sit in about a subject that's very important. We have Dayvon Love, who is here with us today, and he is a Baltimore based political organizer and the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, LBS, a grassroots think tank that advances the public policy interests of Black people. In 2010, Love co founded Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle, one of many organizations that successfully pressured the state of Maryland to disband its plans to build a juvenile jail downtown. LBS has also led legislative advocacy efforts regarding criminal justice reform, youth, and community empowerment. Devon is also the author of Worse Than Trump, The American Plantation, a book that offers an important critique of the American political left and a political alternative to the exploitive relationship that Black people have to white institutions. Devon is also the author of When Baltimore Awakes, which is a comprehensive critique of the way the white supremacy is embedded in the human and social service sector in Baltimore. I bring to you Dayvon Love. Hey, Dayvon, thank you so much for joining us this morning. How are you today?
I'm good. Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, you know what? Let me just say this to you. I have a lot of respect for Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle, and it is such an amazing organization that has filled a gap for the truth, right? And we don't always get the truth. We don't even know what the truth is half the time, and it's your organization that's my go-to to pay attention to what's going on, because you guys have your boots on the ground and you're getting that information, and I'm really grateful, and this community is grateful for your service. Now
Thank you.
you're here because of another issue that is impacting our community. I want
Mhm.
you to open this up and talk about it, and then we'll just go through this process. Why are we here today? What's the issue?
Yeah. So again, just want to thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be with you. One of the things that's been a major issue over the past several years is the issue of police accountability.
Mhm.
And there are a variety of different conversations, discourses, solutions that are thrown out there. I think it's really important we think about, what is it? What should be the goal? Like, how should we as a community assess both the importance and the function of law enforcement and police accountability? Like, what should that look like for our community? And when we look historically, one of the things that's guided LBS's work and many of our partners in terms of what the North Star is for police accountability, what is at the top of the list is community oversight of law enforcement, right? So when you look at, because police brutality, I'm sure as you know, is not something that's a new phenomenon, right? It's something that
Mhm.
historically has been an issue that Black people have faced. And when you look particularly in the middle and late 60s, you have many of the urban rebellions that happened around the country came as a result of police encounters, police violence. And many of the organizations, both the kind of traditional historic civil rights organizations and some of the radical Black Power organizations, one of the places where there was agreement was on the importance of community oversight of law enforcement. It's also important to note that it is community oversight of law enforcement from which the Fraternal Order of Police, which is kind of the container for law enforcement's advocacy on the issue, it has been community oversight that has been one of the most important targets of the FOP. That has been one of the things they've been most resistant to.
Mhm.
So you'll hear conversations about there need to be more police training. You'll hear conversations about body cameras, right? But one of the things that again gets the most pushback is the ability for people in the community to have the power to both be involved and conduct independent investigations and to be able to dispense discipline for officers that do harm to our community. So that's something that's been difficult. So taking us up to our present moment, the last session, there was a major change in Maryland law. Maryland was one of the first states to establish a law enforcement officers Bill of Rights. And it's important when we think about the historical context that it emerges. I mentioned the civil rights movement, and then I mentioned, excuse me, the advocacy around community oversight. Well, as you can imagine, during that period of time, where there was a lot of, the activism, it was kind of the zenith in
Okay.
some ways of the Black freedom struggle. Law enforcement saw that movement and characterized it as anti police. And the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights emerged as a pushback against those movements, a pushback against what people on the ground wanted to see in terms of police accountability. Last session, the 2021 General Assembly passed legislation that did a variety of things. One of them was repeal the Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, but replaced it with a new disciplinary matrix that in it does have more opportunities for the community to be in the police department's internal process. But what it also does is that it required the establishment of police accountability boards. These are supposed to be, boards from which the community has some say over. And what leadership didn't do is an honest oversight in passing that piece of legislation is they didn't consider the fact that there's some jurisdictions, and there are only two in the state, Baltimore and Prince George's County, that have existing oversight entities. Baltimore has had a civilian review board since 1999. And there was an effort in 99 for Baltimore City to achieve community oversight, to have the ability to conduct investigations and discipline police officers. Now, unfortunately, what ended up happening in 99 is that our civilian review board was not given all of the powers that the community wanted in terms of investigation and ability to discipline.
Baltimore's. Okay.
Baltimore's correct. So
Mhm.
because Baltimore City's police department is technically a state agency, so we actually have to go to the state in order to change policy as it relates to the police department in Baltimore City. And so that civilian review board has existed since 99. It does have subpoena power and investigatory power. And so, what we thought of this coming session to reconcile the two, right? Because last session's bill required the establishment of police accountability boards that would receive complaints from the public. But then there's also this civilian review board that has existed since 99. So, those two roles are duplicative of each other. And so, for us, the natural thought is to combine them, to absorb the new powers of the police accountability boards that come from the legislation last year and absorb that into the existing civilian review board, giving it more power, giving it more resources, which brings us closer to having a community oversight entity that has power. Unfortunately, the administration, the Scott administration, has come out against it. Now we've been in conversation, um, with the administration and trying to find a way to get to a place where we can both agree. And those conversations are ongoing. But the administration had initially opposed this effort.
But hold on. Why would the what's the benefit of the city opposing this?
So that was the question that we had. And what the city's initial plan was they were going to build this new police accountability board that's required by the bill that last session, HB 670, and then eventually get rid of the civilian review board to abolish it. The problem with that is that if you abolish the civilian review board, there's certain powers that it does have, those subpoena powers and investigatory powers, that would be lost if it was abolished. So that's been part of our pushback to explain to the administration, if civilian oversight, community oversight is something that they're truly interested in, then merely nixing the CRB and building this new structure takes us in the opposite direction, in the direction of weakening community oversight.
So, but that, oh, okay. There's no place in my brain for this to fit. Okay, I can't, this doesn't make sense to me.
Mhm.
It, no, it really doesn't make sense to me. I need you to help me step, and I'm sure that there's some other people that are
Mhm.
out there that are listening that don't understand this. And if
Mhm.
you've already had a review board in place that was it doing its job? Was it meeting the goals and the objectives or the requirements for what this board was set up and established to do?
So the board historically has not been given the sufficient resources it needs, right? And so I think, given its limited capacity, I think it's done what it can. And over the past 6 years, there's been renewed attention to the Civilian Review Board, and it's done some good things. So a part of the proposal that we and others have put forward is to use the bill that passed last year to strengthen the Civilian Review Board, to
But
give
hold
it
on,
the additional resources.
hold that right there. The additional resources. What are those additional resources that are being requested? What are those? What's that line item for? You get more
Hmm.
money. What needs to happen in that
Hmm.
review board, or what is it? What's going to change
Hmm.
that to be impactful for the community?
Absolutely. So the Civilian Review Board, because of its limited budget, has not had, for instance, the number of investigators that it needs, right, to
Mm.
be able to, address all the complaints, right. It doesn't have the resources it needs to do the outreach, so it can be deeper in the community, so that there's more awareness of what's happening with the Civilian Review Board. It's limited in the amount of the kinds of complaints it can take. So there are only 5 categories of complaints that currently the Civilian Review
What
Board
are
can
they?
take in. Um, I don't know almost off the top of my
That's
head. It's
okay,
like
but it's whatever you.
harassment. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. But it's and so whereas the bill that we're pushing for, with all complaints would be able to be received by the CRB. So these are the things that have been limitations of the Civilian Review Board, and the limitations have been documented both in the Civilian Oversight Task Force that was published as a part of the consent decree, and a new report that came out recently outlined many of the limitations of the CRB that are due to the lack of resources and investment in the Civilian Review Board, right? So it's one of those things that if there was more resources put into it, that it could be highly functional, it would be able to be even more effective than it's been able to be over the
Okay.
years.
So the resources that are needed, is that coming out of the state budget, or is that coming out of the Baltimore City budget, or a combination?
So what we've advocated for is that 2% of the police department's budget would go to the CRB, right? Now we're willing to negotiate on that, right? Because for those who are listening who are familiar, the police department's budget is at about $500 million,
Wait,
right?
say
So
that
it's a
again. Wait. What's a half of what are you doing with a $500 million for the police department? What are they doing using that for?
it's a lot of money, and I'm among those who advocate that we need to find ways that shifts those resources to other places that are more productive. But currently, the police department's budget has been, or the public safety line item in the budget is above $500 million. It broke
A
half a
half
billion
a
a couple
billion.
half of $500 million.
$500 million, and kids can't get computers in their homes or internet connection because Comcast is so expensive. But then you want to tell me that the police department has a $500 million to
And so
do
that's
what?
why Exactly.
What did
So
they
that's
do to
why
50? Wait, I'm sorry. Hold on, Dayvon. You can't tell me say $500 million and then go on to the next line, because we need to wait a minute. A $500 million. What does that $500 million and the impact that it has for they're not even okay. What are they using that $500 million for?
So, I mean, about 180 million of it are commitments for pension and benefits and retirement, but a large portion of it is personnel. And Baltimore City, last I checked, had the highest per capita police to population ratio of any either first or second in the United States.
What does that
Um,
mean? Is that like 10 cops per person per citizen of?
Essentially. Right. So that ratio is the highest or second highest, last I checked, of any
But what are the
jurisdiction in
police
the country.
doing? Because we have murders that are at an all-time high, over 300 and something murders. So what are the police doing about investigating murders? Then, not to mention, we've lost most of our businesses because of crime in the city. What else is in that budget?
And I'm gonna connect my answer to this question to our initial piece, because one of the things that has happened is that, when myself and others have talked about police accountability, a lot of times people primarily talk about it in terms of addressing police violence, right? And while that's important, police accountability is also important as a issue of public safety. Because when you look at law enforcement, the reason that a civilian review board is so important, or community oversight is so important, is because any industry that has no mechanism of oversight and that is insulated from oversight is prone to corruption.
Mhm.
And so law enforcement has been able to operate largely shielded from public view in terms of its internal workings, right?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. But it's a public agency.
It is. So that's why, like when I mentioned the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, that was a statute that provided tremendous protections from the public's ability to be able to engage in oversight of law
But
enforcement.
wait a minute. Wait. I'm sorry. Bear with me, Dayvon. I
Hmm.
told you I didn't know. I didn't understand this. So you're
Hmm.
going to have to bear with me, please.
Yep.
If in fact we have an oversight committee that was charged with managing this whole process, why can't our oversight committee speak to the chief and whomever else is part of his leadership to eradicate all this foolishness?
So what you just laid out is our perspective. The CRB in the way that its power was limited when it was established, right? So it can make a recommendation to the commissioner about discipline, but it has no power to actually execute discipline. It does have investigatory power, so it can create its own separate investigation. So to your question, from our perspective, that's the importance of having a community oversight entity.
Right, right.
Because if you allow police to police themselves,
But it
right?
ain't
They haven't.
happening. It
Exactly,
ain't
exactly,
happening. Bob,
exactly.
go sit down. You don't have to bother with that. We ain't listening to them. They don't have no power no way. This is what we gonna do. That's what's happening inside those offices, right?
Exactly,
That's
exactly,
real. That's real.
exactly.
So
Right.
so we need to have a review board that has the power that says yay or nay.
Right. So that's ultimately what we want. Now, here's the thing about the bill that we're working on this session, is that we don't even go that far,
Okay.
right? We simply want the existing CRB with the investigation and subpoena powers that it has. We simply want that to remain, and that the new structure the state requires of every jurisdiction to be absorbed into that, so
Wait a
that we
minute.
can.
I got lost.
So the bill that passed last session on police reform,
Okay.
one of the things that it did was it requires all 24 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland to establish what they're calling police accountability boards,
Okay.
that really are a version of what a civilian review board would be, right? But Baltimore City and Prince George's County, they're the only jurisdictions that have an existing thing. Other jurisdictions don't have a CRB.
Okay.
So when leadership was crafting the bill last year, they were, and
Well,
I
hold
think it was
on.
on
Whose leadership? Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Because
in Annapolis. So
in
Speaker of the
Annapolis.
House, Senate President.
So these people are the people that are represented in Annapolis, representing Baltimore City and the rest of the state in Annapolis. And their
Correct.
votes, the people that we elect,
That's right.
are down there making those kinds of decisions when they raise their hand and say aye.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
I just
Right.
want to
Yep.
be, because this is an
Yep.
election year, right?
Yep. That's right.
Okay.
Yep. And so last session, when they voted that through, when they were constructing it, again, since Prince George's County, Baltimore City are the only jurisdictions that have existing entities, the requirement for every jurisdiction to have a police accountability board, it was an oversight. They didn't think about the fact that Baltimore City already had something, whereas the other jurisdictions don't. So it created this dilemma where Baltimore City has a civilian review board, but they're also requiring the establishment of these police accountability boards. So those responsibilities, they overlap.
So, so the people that represented Baltimore City allowed something to overlap because they didn't know that we already had it.
It was an oversight because
Wait,
they were
why,
because
how is there an oversight? Your job is to go down there and represent our community. Is that right?
yeah, I mean, I
But you need to
think
help. You need to help me step this through, Dayvon,
yeah,
because I'm
yeah.
not. There's no place in my brain for what you're saying to fit, and it
Hmm.
keeps throwing stuff out because it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the police accountability work last session, what people were trying to do is develop a standardized process by which every jurisdiction had something, had the same thing, right? Had the same process. So what I'm describing in terms of the police accountability boards is something that they're requiring of every jurisdiction because they wanted to standardize it so that it's the same across the board. And I think and I get that like logically why someone would say we want the same thing across the board. There were so many things that were considered last session that that's why I'm saying it makes sense to me that given all the stuff that in terms of the complexity of policing, that it makes sense to me that it was an oversight and the bill that we're putting forward fixes the problem, right? By saying instead of building this new thing, let's just build on the thing we already have,
Right.
and give it the resources it needs to be and the independence it needs to be the oversight entity of over law enforcement.
So you need to help me through this.
Hmm.
What's happening with policing in Baltimore or Prince George's County is not the same policing that's occurred in Western Maryland. It's
Hmm.
not the same as in Southern Maryland. It's not the
Hmm.
same in the Appalachia of Maryland. It's not the same. It's
That's right.
not the same out in parts of Baltimore County. It's not the same.
Hmm.
It's just not the same, and the requirements are not the same. And quite frankly, how do we reconcile that when there's no equity in requirements or services that are needed?
That's
How
right.
is that possible?
So the bill that we supported last session, it addresses what you're raising. So our position last session was each jurisdiction should have the option of establishing an entity that has the powers that we're describing, and that it shouldn't be required, but it should be something that the jurisdictions are allowed to construct. Because, as you mentioned, each jurisdiction has different dynamics that it's dealing with. The leadership in Annapolis felt differently, and they wanted uniformity across the
But
board.
how can it be uniform when the communities that they're talking about aren't uniform?
Exactly. So that
I mean,
was the
that
point
doesn't
we were
make sense
making.
to me.
Yeah,
Somebody
yeah,
needs to explain that. Really? I mean, how does that happen?
yeah, yeah.
What
So
what's
and so yeah, my our perspective. So we it's funny because what you're describing, this was our point. This is the point that we were making to them, which is why we were pushing, a different bill that again that really allowed the jurisdictions to determine what they needed based off of the particular circumstances in those jurisdictions. I'll say this: the issue is that when it comes to law enforcement, there's even in this moment where there's more public criticism of policing, law enforcement is still an entity that has tremendous amounts of influence, tremendous amounts of money. There's still a level of reverence that people have of law enforcement, so that whatever they say is something that's given a tremendous amount of weight. Things that should be simple are difficult because of. So I'll give an example, like a bill that actually passed last session, and I would argue, kind of the best bill of the policing bills that passed last session was a bill that simply is it was called Anton's Law, named after a young man that was killed a few years ago on the Eastern Shore at the hands of law enforcement. And what the bill simply does is allow the investigatory records of law enforcement to be available for public disclosure.
mm-hmm,
Prior to last session, it was prohibited.
mm,
So just as any resident can do a Public Information Act request for government records, that it was prohibited for records of law enforcement's the investigation of individual police officers, that was prohibited from
wait a minute.
public disclosure.
Wait a minute. Say that one more time.
So just as residents can make Public Information Act requests, right? So if you wanted to go to Department of Transportation, you can make a Public Information Act requests, and they have to give you information about, records and the like that you request. Well, as it relates to law enforcement and police officers' investigatory records, so the record of investigations done against law enforcement, the file, that prior to last session, those files were prohibited from public disclosure. So it was unlawful. So police officers' investigatory records were sealed from public view.
What?
Last session, and that's something we actually been working on for a while. Last session that actually finally passed, where now those records are able to be
Available.
disclosed. Now, what law enforcement agencies around the state have done is that they've actually tried to find loopholes. One of them being charging large amounts of money for the records, right? As an example,
Wait
right?
a minute.
So they'll say, let's say I make a request anonymously for a list of officers' records. They may come back to me and say, well, this cost us $100,000, so you got to pay us $100,000 for us to get you those records. So that's actually what's happening around the state of Maryland.
Wait a minute. These are government agencies, are they not?
That's right.
So
That's
a
right.
government agency charges hundreds of thousands of dollars to get somebody's record that's in a file cabinet
That's
that
right.
you can pull out of a file. See, y'all, I hope y'all listening to this
Mhm.
foolishness. This
Mhm.
right here. So you can go into Bob's file,
Mhm.
pull up Bob's file that didn't cost you anything because it's in a manila folder, right? It's in a folder in a drawer. To pull it
Mhm.
out, to give it to somebody, they're going to charge you to look in this. At a
Mhm.
state-run agency, a government agency. This is not a
Mhm.
for-profit corporation.
That's
This
right.
is a government agency that
Mhm.
makes you pay to get a report about a cop that is doing something illegal. Is
Mhm.
that what you just said to me?
That's what's happening. That's what's happening. And I mentioned that to highlight the problem, which is that we're
That's
interested
one little
in.
problem. That's like a that's an elephant right there.
Yep. Yep. And so and it speaks to the larger dynamic where law enforcement as an institution does not want oversight. They're so used to
Oh, I
being able
guess
to do
not.
things in the
You
dark.
got 100 grand. What else you doing with that money?
Hmm.
What else are you doing
Exactly.
with that money for real? No wonder you don't
Hmm.
want nobody to have oversight if you giving out charges just to get a report. If you got to
Hmm.
respond to somebody and then he said, "Oh yeah, bye. Here you got to pay the toll
Hmm.
for
That's
a
right.
police department."
That's right.
That's a
That's right.
government agent. It's not a private security company.
Hmm. Right. So this is why we need oversight. This is why we need a stronger civilian review board that has the resources it needs to be able to have the investigators. And we need to, if we can't get disciplinary power, at the very least, maintain the ability to do independent investigations and to be able to have subpoena power to compel people to make statements. So that's for us. That's why it's important to build on the existing civilian review board that has those powers instead of what the city's position has been in the past, which is to build this new police accountability board and to nix the CRB. So that's what and like I said, we're in talks with the administration, trying to get to a place where we can see eye to eye. Those talks are still in progress, and we haven't reached a place where there's mutual agreement entirely. Um, and I'll give the administration some credit, and they've caved to some of the things that we've said in terms of the importance of the powers of the civilian review board. Um, but they're still very insistent on building, these new police accountability boards as opposed to building on what we currently have, right? So there's currently a civilian review board, and we just think it makes more sense to build on what we have as opposed to building an entirely new entity. Um,
So
so
what
that's
should
that's what we
we
are.
so what should we do as a community? What is our charge? How do we impact this? What do voters need to do? What should we be telling the voters to do? What should we be telling our state representatives to do? So
Hmm.
everybody should know who their state legislators are
That's right.
for the House and the Senate, right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
is there a document that states all of this, that gets distributed to different community organizations? How can the community, citizens,
Hmm.
how can citizens, taxpayers, be a participant to help deal with this?
Hmm. So I would say three things. One is so if you go to LBS's website, so lbsbaltimore.com, there's a place on our website that gives a description of what we're advocating for and runs down some of these issues for folks that want to get acclimated. Um, and so what I'll say is as I said before, that one of the things that is top of mind is public safety. And too often, I think the knee jerk reaction is, um, you know, more sentences, more law enforcement. And what I want in terms of a shift in the conversation about public safety is for people to recognize that in terms of the quality of law enforcement, that if folks want quality law enforcement that can actually go after those that are the drivers of violence in our community, because too often law enforcement is getting at people who they're not the ones
So
driving
some of them
the
people are
crime.
getting paid too, so they look the other way. So don't get me started on that conversation.
Exactly. And that is made possible because of the lack of oversight. It is made
Mhm.
possible because that information is not something that is available to the public, and that there's not an entity that has the power to engage in that oversight. So I just want to emphasize that the issue of police accountability and community oversight, while it is important in terms of addressing police violence, it's also important from a public safety perspective. Because if you don't have oversight, then there's no incentive for there to be quality law enforcement where you can actually apprehend those that are the drivers of violence. One of the things I saw in one of the comments is around who's serving on these boards,
Right.
and so currently, like civilian review board membership, there are some that are ex officio members. The NAACP, ACLU, Vanguard Justice Society, Fraternal Order Police, but the majority of the board members are residents of the nine police districts that the city is split up into, right? The current civilian review board. Now I'm open to that changing so that there are more people that represent, from the community that are on it. But currently there are nine spots specifically for residents that live in those one of those nine police districts. So I mentioned that because I think one of the things I would ask the public to do is when there are opportunities to engage in service of these kinds of entities for people to get involved, right? So, regardless of what happens this session, there's going to be a need for people to serve, either whether it's on the civilian, and there are actually currently vacancies on the civilian review board in terms of folks in those nine districts. So I would ask people that have time, some spare time, to get involved, because that's one of the things that if we don't have people that are actually involved on those boards, we can have all the power, investigatory stuff we need, but if we don't have people that are serving in those positions, they'll defeat the purpose. So that's one thing I would say is to get involved. And then lastly, what I would say is, one of the things I'm really grateful for, over the past 9 years at this point of me doing work in Annapolis, one of the things that I've noticed as of late is that, when people reach out to their legislators and echo many of the things that like we've talked about this morning, it has an impact on legislators' decisions in terms of the
Mhm.
decisions they make. And so when you go to lbsbaltimore.com, you can reach out to your legislator and tell them to support it's SB 441, Senate Bill 441, House Bill 991. And so when people reach out and tell their legislator, even it's a quick email or even a quick call, those things actually go a very long way.
Do you have like a draft letter that people could download that says all these different things so that you
That's right.
can you speak to that?
Yeah, so on the site where we have the action alerts, so we call them action alerts. And so in the text of the action alerts, it gives a description of what it is that we're asking people to say to their legislator. So for this bill, the text says, like, we demand that the legislature strengthen the civilian review board by passing Senate Bill 441, for example,
Mhm.
right? So it provides the information a person needs to be able to, make that call or email to their legislator, and
Mhm.
that's really important, because again, it goes a long way, even if it feels like just a call, and again, we're getting a lot of resistance. I mean, I
From
wasn't
where?
expecting. Well, I mentioned the administration,
Mhm.
um, which is plenty. But then, look, people are influenced by the position law enforcement takes. Like in the legislature, there's just a lot of conservatism, for lack of a better word, on the issue of public safety. Because what people do is people equate taking power away from law enforcement as undermining efforts towards public safety. Like that, and it's often not said that plainly, but anything that like gives black people more rights as it relates to law enforcement is translated as a effort to undermine police officers' ability to do their jobs. And so as a community, it's important that we resist that binary. Like we resist, like we should say that the community should have oversight over law enforcement, while also simultaneously also being able to say that we want to address public safety. And I think too often those things are described as if they're at odds with each other. I argue those things they're interconnected, right? That if we have more oversight, if the rights of black people are protected as it relates to law enforcement, then people are able to build the relationships and community with law enforcement to be able to effectively go after those that are truly those that are driving, violence in our community.
So I have a question. So if we were to look at the state in its totality and the different environments where race is an issue,
Hmm.
right? The populations where there are a larger population of black people versus the other counties, right?
Hmm.
And they're only between the city and Prince George's County and maybe the part of the Eastern Shore,
Hmm.
right? More like Cambridge. But what other pockets are there of Black people and the impact of a statewide expectation versus pockets of expectation? So if you're in Frostburg or Cumberland versus being in parts of Prince George's County or Baltimore City, there's a difference in the expectation of law enforcement's duties.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
also, there's a different relationship to all the white cops in Cumberland and Frostburg than all the black people that live in Baltimore and the white cops that are here and how they treat us.
Hmm. That, I mean, look, you make a very important point, and this is a point that unfortunately, like when I've come down to Annapolis to testify on related issues, one of the things that becomes increasingly clear to me is that many of the legislators that are on these committees that are made responsible for making these decisions have no clue about the world that many of us live in the places you described: Baltimore City, parts of Prince George's County, parts of Eastern Shore, even parts of Montgomery County,
Right,
parts of Anne Arundel
right,
County.
right.
Like, they're like have no clue in terms of the world that we live in. And so, and I give to me, which is a great example. I remember in 2016, so this was the year after the uprising, the Freddie Gray uprising in Baltimore City. And I had been hearing from people in the community about law enforcement beating people up, selling drugs, stealing money. Like, I've been hearing about it. But I remember this was still at a time where
Mm-hmm,
saying those things about law enforcement, they wouldn't believe it.
mm-hmm.
To them, it was conspiracy theory. And it wasn't until the revelations of the Gun Trace Task Force came out, right, where they have the federal prosecution of law enforcement in Baltimore City, where they exposed that all this stuff was happening. And what it showed me was that in these other jurisdictions who have totally different experiences of law enforcement, that the experiences that we have to them For many of them, they refuse to believe it. They refuse to believe it.
Wait a
And,
minute, what?
and many of the legislators, when we explain to them just the ways in which law enforcement has been abusive towards the community, right? That they refuse to believe it. And at this point, now we have lots of evidence at this point, right, of the way in which law enforcement has been a detriment in our community. They have all the evidence we need now, but there's still legislators who reject it, and because the world that they exist in, law enforcement, particularly many of them who are white, many of them who don't live in places like you talked about, Baltimore City, Prince George's County, parts of Anne Arundel, parts of Montgomery, that they refuse to believe it, right? And one of the things that I'm expecting, so before we talked about that law that got changed last session around the Public Information Act request,
Hmm.
I actually believe that one of the reasons we're getting that's getting so much resistance is because they're going to be exposed,
Right.
right? Because I just don't believe that Calvert County or Frederick County or Harford County or Cecil County or St. Mary's County, I don't believe that they're not abusing black people, right? I don't
You
believe
better not believe it.
that.
You
Right?
be
It's
real.
just and one of the things in testifying for that bill that I'm referencing last session, one of the things I would say in my testimony, I would say to the legislature, if I were to ask you, are people being abused by police in your jurisdiction? Your only legitimate answer is, I don't know,
Right.
because the information we need to know that
It's not available.
is not available.
And why is it not available? Because we can't get the people that work in our jurisdiction to do what they need to do to make certain that that's done.
That's right.
So, is there a bill? No, I guess it's not a bill, but there's something that we should be as citizens. Um, that, and I live in East Baltimore, and I see cops just sitting and watching drug deals go down, and like it don't mean nothing to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? It don't mean a thing to them. They don't care if you see them or you don't see them because they're not
Mm-hmm.
dealing with none of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we already know the truth. So uh, the documents that you have in your office that says something that we need to send a letter to all of our legislators that are in Annapolis. And there needs to be a different letter that goes to all those people who are out in Frostburg and Cumberland and all those other places because they don't have a clue. And I've had an experience out in Frostburg with Alvin Ailey Dance, the camp, Ailey camp we used to have out there. That was
Mm-hmm.
years ago, 1990 something. But Lord, I'll never forget that experience as long
Mm-hmm.
as I live.
Wow.
I thought South Bend, Indiana was something. This right here is a whole nother world out there. Now that was
Mm-hmm.
long ago, and I'm sure it hasn't changed that much, right?
Right. In fact, just really quickly, so when I talked about those police accountability boards that every jurisdiction is required to create, so what we're seeing across the state, because other jurisdictions are having to establish these boards because they don't have anything,
Right.
and they're getting resistance because the community wants to be, like, for instance, in places like Calvert County, where they want to make the community wants to make sure there's black representation on this board. So
Right.
things as simple as having like black people on these boards that are being created, like, and giving it more power, making sure that there aren't former law enforcement, right, that serve on those boards, like that. But like it's been a fight in those jurisdictions amongst the community to have those things implemented in a way that actually gives the community some ability to engage in oversight. So yeah, the resistance to this notion of community oversight, we're not just seeing it in Baltimore City. We're seeing it in the other jurisdictions as well.
Well, you're going to see it in other jurisdictions because people will say that's not happening out here anyway. And the
Mm-hmm.
population, the black populations may be small, but they're still impactful. And
That's
they
right.
could care less about what happens to a black person that might be doing something wrong. They don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, and yeah, I'm going to say it, in many cases there's so much racism in some of these communities that's
Mm-hmm.
clouding their decision.
That's right.
And
That's
I've
right.
sat with superintendents out there and principals out there, and I'm talking about alien, and this is a true story. I saw it myself. And
Mm.
people were sitting there saying, "Oh, we don't have any at-risk people out here. This is not happening
Wow.
out here. We don't
Mm,
have none of that." And you
mm,
standing there looking like, "Are you quick? Wait a minute." And
right.
then you've got to deal with all of that hate and vitriol in these
Hmm.
communities. And we think that we're protected from that, and we aren't as a people.
That's right.
We
That's right.
aren't. And
That's right.
there's a lot of hate in these communities. There's a lot of
Hmm.
hate when people get stopped. There's a
Hmm.
lot of hate from these folks that have been imported, that are not even from the state of Maryland, that are coming from Pennsylvania, and they're coming from these hills, okay? Or they're coming
Hmm.
from these southern communities that have a different attitude about melanin.
Hmm. Yep.
And we have to
Yep.
deal with racism, the fact that racism does exist, and this has to change. And I don't
Hmm.
understand why the city of Baltimore doesn't even understand that, because we got racism happening throughout this city,
That's right.
educationally, philosophically.
Hmm.
That doesn't even make
Absolutely.
sense to me.
Absolutely. And see, to me, a part of why the issue of community oversight is so important in the conversation about law enforcement, because for me, it really demonstrates one of the ways in which white supremacy operates in a society, in the sense that the notion of giving black people power over law enforcement, and it
Right.
won't ever get said this way, but that notion is offensive to
How
those in law
dare you?
enforcement.
How dare
Exactly.
you? We don't want
Exactly.
these niggers on here. Come on
Hmm.
now.
That's it. That's it. And
Come
that
on
and
now.
that and that runs the thread through what's happening in other jurisdictions in addition to Baltimore City. That's the thread that runs through it. It is that the notion that we're going to give these regular everyday black people power to discipline law enforcement,
How
power
dare
to
you?
investigate, and that notion is something that's important, because when we talk about like why it is that Baltimore City and just the state of Maryland is the way it is, even though it's a Democratic Party supermajority, right? This is a place where, like, LBS, we spend a lot of time being critical of the Democratic Party leadership, right? And that's not to say we support Republicans, but it's to say that the Democratic Party leadership, in the level of power that it has in the state, is not delivering for black people. And
Why
this is
not?
one of those instances.
Why
Well,
not?
because I would argue that the Democrat there's a wing of the Democratic Party that is used to having black people in a sharecropper role in terms of the relationship to the party, right? That you have
Wait a minute. Wait a
those.
minute. Wait. Wait a minute. Used to
So
having black people in a sharecropper role. How is that?
so black people, I think traditionally, particularly when you think about the party, are not typically in positions to determine where resources go in the party, to determine major policy priorities. That typically black people are given symbolic things from the party,
What does
but
that
on
mean? Wait, back up. You can't just say that. Symbolic. What does that
Mhm.
mean? Symbolic.
So I'll give an example. So I mentioned back in 2016. So after the uprising, there was a commission put together to determine what the policy recommendations would be for police accountability. And what I argued back then was, based on my knowledge of the history of Democratic Party leadership in the state, that they would aim to try to put forward a package of bills that would look like it does a lot. But what would remain unchanged is the power of black people in relationship to the police department. That black people would not be given positions of power at the time on trial boards, or be given the power to investigate law enforcement independently. Those are things that give black people power. And I remember predicting in the interim between the 2015 and 2016 session that they're gonna talk about body cameras, they're gonna talk about training, they're gonna talk about mental health evaluation, they're gonna talk about a lot of things that in and of itself they're okay, but they don't shift the distribution of power.
Right.
They're not going to give black people power.
Right.
and
But
and
wait
so
a minute.
my
We got a black commissioner here, though, right?
And see, that's the thing. It's like individual black people in those positions, right, don't translate to the collective. And I think,
Mm.
you know what I mean? And so when I was talking about like the symbolic nature and that example back in 2016, like we're talking about like giving residents power over law enforcement, right? Because they're supposed to serve us. It's a public good.
Right.
They're supposed to serve us. And so that's what I mean when I say, in terms of, black people's relationship to the broader Democratic Party, is that they'll give us the stuff that sounds and looks good. But when it comes to actually giving black people power over institutions that white people are used to having control over, that's usually the limitation of the party. And for me, that's a place where the Democratic Party deserves a lot of criticism, because the fact that, again, the bill that we're talking about in terms of civilian review board, that shouldn't be hard,
Right.
right? That's straightforward.
Right.
But it's an issue because it shifts power into the hands of black people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is a fundamental aspect and limitation of the Democratic Party in this state that needs to be pushed if we're actually going to make any headway.
But we have voted people in who are supposed to be representing the needs and the desires of the community in which they serve.
Yeah, and there's some that I think are doing that to varying degrees. I think the issue is I see the Democratic Party, and it's one of the things that I think there isn't enough public conversation about, which is why I'm
Mm-hmm.
glad that we're talking this morning, is there are informal networks of power, of resources, that behind the scenes
Mm-hmm.
are the ones who are actually making the policy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes when we think about black elected officials, we want a lot more out of them, and they certainly should deliver more. But I think as a community, we got to think about what is the power behind them that
Mm-hmm.
puts them in a position to not deliver for our community.
Say that one
That's
more
why.
time. Wait, rewind. Say that one more time.
So I think when we think about, the situation of black elected officials not delivering for our community, and certainly I believe that they should be delivering more, it's important for our community to think about what is the power behind them. Like what are the institutions that exist behind them that are actually putting them in positions such that they're deciding not to cast votes that deliver for our community, right? And so that's why, for instance, it's important to talk about the Fraternal Order of Police, because that's a force within the political arena that
Mm-hmm.
disincentivizes the kind of policies I'm talking about. Or like the Greater Baltimore Committee, right, which is an entity that has tremendous influence. These are major institutions, or
Wait a
even
minute. Did you
philanthropy.
say GBC? The
I did
GBC.
the
So
GBC.
how's the GBC got involvement with the what's happening with the police and stuff? What
Well,
speak to that?
I'll give a
Those are
concrete.
corporations. So for those of you who do not know, the Greater Baltimore Committee is comprised of the large corporations. So that's your BG&E, your
Mhm.
Verizons, and all those major corporations, all your banks, a PNC, and whoever else is here in town. So all those sit on a board and make big decisions about corporate going on and what's happening in the city and in the state. And the person who is the director or the president of that is a former delegate or senator, but
Mhm.
they have a lot of power.
That's right. That's right. And I think one of the things that so like the and I give a concrete example. A few years ago, the GBC was behind a bill that enhanced sentences for certain offenses. And our argument is that
How,
when
wait a minute, stop. What do you mean the GBC? What?
so the GBC was big supporters behind the scenes of legislation that
How do you know
was,
that? Was it
well,
written?
yeah, they testified in support of the bills that we were opposing around increasing mandatory minimums, right? So they wanted to increase mandatory minimums, and they supported it. And so that's what I mean in terms of like the forces behind. Like that's an entity that exercises tremendous
Hmm.
influence, and they often don't publicize it, right? But we know based on the fact that they did testify on the record in support of mandatory minimums, but we knew, excuse me, being in the position we were in, they were behind it. And then philanthropy plays a big role in this town in
What
terms
does
of
that mean?
influence. So for instance, like the Able Foundation, like Bob Embry is someone that exercises a lot of power in this town. Uh, and I would argue that folks like him, like black people get blamed. Black people get blamed for a lot of the problems in our community. But in many contexts, there are folks like Bob Embry that actually exercise a lot of power and decision making as to how Baltimore is the way it is.
But we have our own Senate, we have our own senators, we have our own legislators, we have our own mayor. So how can some outside entity make that impact with our mayor and our city council and our legislative bodies?
Because I think these entities that I'm describing have organized money and resources.
Oh,
And I think
cash.
a part of and I would argue that one of the things that I think is very important for Black people, because I think we focus too much on individual people as opposed to building institutions that can produce people that we put in office. See, a lot of the people who are in office were not selected by us. These are people who are curated by some of the institutions that I'm talking about, and we're given the choice of those who were curated by those larger institutions. I think one of the things that we need to do is begin to organize our own institutions that have money and resources so that we put people in office instead of selecting from those who, these institutions have curated for us.
That's a powerful statement. Curated. They've
Absolutely.
curated. So curation, it's like going into an art gallery and saying what you want on the wall,
Hmm.
and does the light shine right over here, or is this, that curation is deep. That's a
Absolutely.
deep, deep statement and very powerful, sir.
Absolutely.
That's
And those and,
powerful.
and people who run for office, all of them know there's certain meetings you go to. There's certain programs that you participate in. Like if you're running for office, people know. It's not written anywhere, but it's like that you go through the GBC's leadership program, right? You know that you go to certain fundraisers, right? You go to certain convenience. There's certain things that, and those aren't things that we control and own. And so that's a part of my urging is we need to start to build that for ourselves, so that we're not reliant on people who have to navigate those spaces, but that we're producing our own people.
Well, I think too. So I did go through the leadership program back in the
Hmm.
90s, and the experience was one that enlightened me to a lot of the things that are going on in the community, right? And how
Hmm.
business operates. Now, we didn't get into curation, but
Hmm.
it was something that it helped me, not being from Baltimore, to understand what's going on from a state, local, state, and national level, right? And
Hmm.
so I need to be able to say that without
Hmm.
anybody saying, oh, well, she
Hmm.
went through, because I did go
Hmm.
through the leadership program and
Hmm.
it was a great experience for me. And
Hmm.
it gave me insight. It gave me
That's right.
things to talk about and to be really honest about it. So I'm not going to disparage that, because
Hmm.
I took away a lot of good information from that program, right?
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes you need to have that understanding of what you're dealing with. Now, I
Hmm.
would imagine that there are pockets of people who are curating
Hmm.
because they have the power to curate.
Right. And I
Now,
wouldn't say that that program's necessarily bad, but my point is that those are the kinds of things that are often selecting who are the people in our community that get looked at, right?
mhm.
And so my point is simply that we need those kinds of things that our community owns, so that we're not reliant on those programs to produce what is our leadership in our
Well,
community.
that sounds like a new division over at LBS, right?
Yeah, that's something we might have to work on.
That sounds like a new division, right? And I think the key here is everybody needs to be involved. People need
Hmm.
to come out, COVID, but let's open the door or open up the computers. Let's have an opinion. So you have the right to send an email. You have the right to send a letter. You have a right to call your legislators. You have a right to understand the
Hmm.
laws. You have the right to understand the impact that this whole business is about to have on your life, on the life of your neighbors, on the life of your family, and your life, right? And
Hmm.
so if we go back to, and we're getting ready to wrap it up, but we go back to your lbsbaltimore.com,
Hmm.
and there's information, there are draft letters that you can send to your Senate, to your delegates, to the Speaker of the House. You can write, you have the right to write all these people. You have the right to write to send to all of these nonprofit organizations that are circling around this project, wanting it to happen. And so follow you and tell us, keep letting us know what's going on. I think what you're doing, what you guys have been doing for a long time, has been wonderful, and we need your voice. And as you know, this station and ours are open to you all whenever you need it or want it. This is really powerful, and this is really upsetting to me that we are having this conversation, and the most of the people that are being impacted by this conversation look like us.
That's right. That's right.
They look
That's right.
like us, and it's not
Yeah.
acceptable.
That's right. That's right. Well, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be able to talk about this. It's really important, and there's support like this that makes our work possible.
Well, and know that I'm available whenever you guys need us.
Yeah, appreciate that.
All
Appreciate
right.
that.
Oh my gosh. Dayvon, you have really shared a lot with us, and we're really excited for it. And Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, please go to the website. You take care. God bless you, and thank you for your service.
All right. Thank you. You all
All
take
right.
care.